So I chose The Giver as the text to explore more deeply through a scholarly article. The article that I chose is actually a thesis that explores the diversity and sameness in children's literature, and it uses the entire Giver quartet to explore this idea and the extremes of which are included in the series. And the author here essentially stresses the importance of including books like The Giver and the often drastic and extreme examples of either sameness or diversity within young adult literature. Grounded in substantial textual evidence and subsequent explanations, I do think that the author is persuasive, and I agree with their claims. So with their cited scientific evidence throughout the paper, I feel like this article enhanced or strengthened the current views that I had on The Giver. I've always had a very strong belief about children being able to read as much as they can on as many topics as they can. And while there are some incredibly dark themes and scenes throughout The Giver in particular, the author of this article really drove home the point about the importance of allowing children to be exposed to those views, to see that sameness is perhaps not as truly as ideal as it can be made out to be, and that the more diversity they're able to experience, especially through literature, which is oftentimes more relatable through the protagonist, can have a really positive or meaningful impact on children as they approach diversity and diverse situations in their real life. A quote from the conclusion of the paper that really kind of struck me reads, quote, "Diversity and sameness represent a rich source of discussions provoking a reader's critical thinking and perception of society from a different point of view," end quote. From a purely observatory standpoint, at this point in my life, much of the parenting that I've seen has been about trying to instill good manners with the end goal of getting their child to be a good person. And while I've seen this improve over the last few years, I think that many parents forget that there's a well-roundedness that can come from allowing their child to be exposed to viewpoints opposite their own, opposite or completely drastic, or things that they haven't even thought about. As the author said, it allows for very fruitful discussions around such topics, and especially in a classroom setting, being able to bounce perspectives and ideas off of their peers really allows children to engage with tough scenarios in a safe environment and kind of help them process through what they think is right and wrong and how certain scenes or subjects made them feel. They can kind of gauge how their peers feel about that as well. And while this isn't a specific disagreement or misunderstanding, I do wish that the author of the article had added some more information on the benefits of children being exposed to diversity, and specifically diversity within literature. The thesis is extensive in and of itself. It's like 35 or 40 pages. But the topic of exposure to diversity and its scientific evidence, like to back that up, is only given a singular chunky paragraph. And I think that adding more evidence from research or further explaining the research that was included would have been really beneficial to help get a truly firm grasp on the importance of exposing children to diversity through literature. And this is probably somewhat obvious, but the general interconnectedness of dystopian novels really popped out at me after reading this article. Specifically, segregation, death, and some form of corrupt government are like especially common themes throughout. With The Giver, we see this in the community members' assignments and the general sameness of the community, and releases, all of which are overseen by that group of elders. I don't have the book in front of me, so I can't remember if that's actually the correct term or not. And then in another very, very popular series, The Hunger Games, we see this with the districts, with the games themselves, and it's all overseen by the Capitol. Obviously, there's a lot of death in that book, specifically the death of children. And one other series that really popped out to me that I can't remember all of the fine details of because it's been so long since I've read it, but the Divergent series I know follows very similarly along with those themes. The factions, they're all overseen by a government, and particularly in one of the faction there are these really brutal training routines, and they can really often result in death if, you know, the candidate isn't up to snuff or, you know, whatever reason. The similarities, as I've said, are somewhat obvious, but those three themes in particular, the segregation, death, and a form of corrupt government, had never really stood out quite as prominently to me as they do or did after having read that thesis, because I thought that really pulled it together, even though it wasn't directly about that. And then in terms of understanding the article more fully, I just wanted to, I guess, add or stress that overall the author of this paper really does an excellent job of defining diversity as a whole. And then they even go into sub-defined diversity within children's literature and specifically highlight a few areas that are either common or lacking and need to have more representation. And then each book from the Giver Quartet is analyzed, numerically ordered, or sequentially ordered rather, and extensively explained to support their view on the importance of including and exposing children to themes of diversity and sameness. And in particular, one of the reasons I chose this as a thesis rather than a specific article is because this thesis actually came from a student from a university in Croatia. So just being able to have a little bit of an outside perspective rather than from the US. It's written by a US-born author, taught really heavily in US schools, and I know a lot of my classmates, perhaps not all of them, but a lot of them are also from the US, so I thought it was really interesting to see the perspective of somebody writing like a full scholarly thesis from another country.